ACLU Senior Policy Analyst Jay Stanley joins the Plutopia podcast this time. Jay researches, writes, and speaks about technology-related privacy and civil liberties issues.
The ACLU is very involved in legislative advocacy. We have a team here in Washington of lobbyists who, work with Capitol Hill and federal agencies to try and stop bad things and encourage good things. And also, a lot of times, just educate, staffers. As everybody knows, Capitol Hill is run by 20-somethings, members of Congress who have to deal with every issue under the sun from A to Z, often aren't very educated on particular abstruse tech issues like what we were talking about, and so just having people who can pick up the phone, people on Capitol Hill call and help educate them about the realities of things.
Hey everybody, welcome to yet another episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm here with my co-hosts, Scoop Sweeney and Wendy Grossman, and our guest, Jay Stanley, who is a senior policy analyst with the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, where he researches, writes, and speaks about technology-related privacy and civil liberties issues and their future. Hopefully not their dubious future. And he also formerly edited ACLU's Free Future blog, but we've just learned that that blog has given way to a whole new set of news and commentary over the last months or years. And Jay, welcome.
Thanks for having me on. This is great.
And just generally, I think the first question we want to ask is what in general is happening at ACLU these days? What issues are getting the most attention?
So, we're pretty unique among large nonprofits because we are such a multi-issue organization covering such a wide scope of issues. We have like 12 legal projects, everything from LGBTQ rights to death penalty, criminal law reform, immigrants' rights, women's rights, civil rights, and national security, freedom on program and religion and belief, and so on. I won't reel them all off, but I work for a project called the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, which is mainly a litigation project, although I'm neither a litigator nor a lawyer. I'm kind of in a think tanky role. And I kind of cover the stuff that the litigators aren't looking at and the lobbyists aren't looking at, but are still important, and the world wants to know what we think, and we need to figure out what we think. And so, we do speech issues and privacy issues and sort of technology and science issues. And for my project, we're engaged in the speech controversies around the Gaza war protests that are happening, and a number of wide variety of other speech litigation. And then on the privacy front, me and my colleagues are sort of working on a wide variety of things. I've been focused lately in particular on digital identity and drones, which I think are two technologies, if you want to call them that are poised to become much bigger than they now are. And the question when we look at these technologies is always, who is technology going to serve? Is it going to increase the power of the already powerful? Is it going to just empower big companies and government agencies, or is it going to empower individual people? And I think a lot of technologies are up for grabs, and they could go either way depending on how they're structured, some cases how they're built, in other cases the legal envelope that surrounds them as they're deployed.
There's a lot of, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you've been working on drones for a long time. Much longer than most people, at least 10 years.
Yeah. I think I got my first press call about drones in like 2003. I've been at the ACLU a long time. I started 5 weeks before 9/11. And at that time, it was just a sexy futuristic technology that some reporter wanted to write about. Since in about 2011, 2012, drones kind of became a real thing. And yet they still haven't really completely flowered or blossomed as a technology because the FAA is holding them back. It's
What happened to that guy who was using drones to track crime in places? He was boasting all this success. Do you remember? It came up at CFP in the around 2010.
Yeah, that was Ross McNutt. Um,
Right.
and he was a colonel in the military, I think in Afghanistan or Iraq, and had overseen these programs of building these gigapixel cameras where they stitch together like hundreds of cell phone cameras basically into one giant gigapixel camera. And he was trying to market this to domestic police departments. And so he had some overseas clients like in Mexico, but he convinced the Baltimore Police Department to adopt this. And he would send his Cessna, his company's Cessna, over the city on behalf of the police for like 12 hours a day, every day, 14 hours a day, daylight, and just circle. And the cameras could record everything that happened in like a 32, 35 square mile area. And it's like TiVo for a city. You could record the comings and goings of any pedestrian or vehicle that's visible from the sky, and using that to try and solve crimes. So my litigator colleagues filed a lawsuit on that on Fourth Amendment grounds and actually prevailed. And so I think it was the Fourth Circuit. And so, the court found that that kind of mass surveillance and tracking of people's locations, easily identifiable, although you might just be a blip to the camera, with ground cameras, with cell phone tracking and everything like that. It's not that hard to connect what's captured in those cameras with people's movements on the ground. And so that was a great victory to have that found unconstitutional. And right now, that was a circuit court, it wasn't the Supreme Court, but it's kind of in some ways the law of the land because there have been no other similar cases, is my understanding. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but that's sort of that was the outcome of that. Someday I expect some police department somewhere or somebody else is going to try again, that kind of mass surveillance audio aerial thing. And there's a whole interesting thing with satellites. There's a huge booming area of microsatellites where all these companies are putting hundreds of shoebox size satellites into low orbit. So at this point you can buy 20 photographs a day of any spot on Earth.
Yeah, they're actually using that a lot in journalism, I know, or somewhat anyway. We interviewed a filmmaker recently who had done a documentary about news and truth, basically. And one thing that he showed was this satellite technology that was being deployed that allowed the journalists to confirm or deny stories that were coming from various places. The main thing was, I think, Bucha in the Ukraine. The Russians had denied that they had killed a bunch of civilians there, but they had satellite surveillance showing that civilians had actually been killed and were just kind of left for dead all over the streets. And the first thing that came to my mind then was, if they're using this so effectively for journalism, it seems like it could be used very effectively for surveillance too.
Yeah, I think that those kinds of satellite photos have been used to document human rights violations for a long time. I have a dim memory of maybe satellite photos being an issue in the former Yugoslavia and some of the genocidal activities that are taking place there. But we're at a whole new level now where you can buy, again, numerous snapshots a day. The resolution is not going to be as high as it would be from a Cessna with a gigapixel camera or from a drone, but it could be high enough for many purposes, and including journalism. And this is something that we sometimes struggle with, which is, if you enable sort of new surveillance infrastructures, they often have good uses. They often have interesting uses. And the question is, do those uses, are they big enough to make up for the downsides of mass surveillance? There's there's no doubt there's probably interesting sociological things you could do with all that satellite data. I know that it's sometimes used for business intelligence. I think there are companies that will use software algorithms to count how many cars are in all the Walmart parking lots in America and things like that.
There was a story about some Tesla skeptics who went around using aerial photographs to count the number of Teslas sitting in the parking lot waiting to be sold, and in order to check Elon Musk's announced numbers.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, there's also the potential to do surveillance, if you're familiar with that concept, which is like surveilling the people who are doing the surveillance, turning the cameras back on them. Seems like.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, you do see that sometimes. For example, there have been people who have obtained troves of license plate reader data and used it to, for example, figure out where the mayor has been driving all around. People have talked about using some of these
Steve
surveillance.
Mann used to go around with his camera and all his equipment, and I remember seeing him do a presentation on it. I ended up feeling really sorry for the people and the clerks and stuff in the stores that he did that in, because they didn't have any power over the surveillance system.
This was somebody who was doing sort of self
Yeah,
life logging.
you don't remember Steve Mann from the University of Toronto?
No, I don't.
I
Oh,
recall meeting him at MIT. Was he at
yeah.
MIT as well?
Yeah, he
Yeah.
was. He went around with all this equipment that got smaller over time. And there was an incident, I think, one time at an airport where they insisted he take off all the equipment to go through the security scanners. And he was very upset because he hadn't taken it off in years. And his lawyer, when they eventually, sort of brought an action, said he was behaving oddly for days afterward, to which the general consensus was, how could you tell? But
Exactly. Hey, I think Scoop had something he wanted to ask. Scoop?
Well, I was going to ask about the spread of the license plate readers, because it's been a controversial subject. Locally they've been able to try and do and prevent the widespread use of them, but there are the big data companies that have bought up the a lot of the license plate readers data, and used it for not just law enforcement, but all sorts of nefarious research on people's movements. Is there any way that is ever going to be controlled?
Well, that's another issue that I've been doing a fair amount of work on. You can have local governments or state governments ban or restrict them. New Hampshire, for example, has passed a law that allows for license plate scanners, but that does not permit the data to be retained if there's no hit. In other words, if your car isn't wanted, you have a bunch of fines due, or what have you. If there's no hit in your car, they're not allowed to retain it for more than 3 seconds. So basically it becomes a search for wanted vehicles. It doesn't become a mass surveillance device that so you can enter in many of these systems. You enter in your license plate, and this huge list of times and places where you've seen pops up. And as the license plate scanners become more densely deployed, at a certain point it becomes tantamount to GPS tracking everybody in a city. At a certain point, constitutional considerations will come in. There's some difficult line drawing questions there. So New Hampshire has basically has turned the devices off as mass surveillance devices, and that other states could do that. The real action is not sort of vigilant, which is these companies. It's this company Flock, which is sort of revolutionized the field because it uses cellular and solar technology to allow for portable installations that don't require any wiring. It has made them much cheaper, and not only sells to the police, but also sells to homeowner associations and private businesses. And so that company has been getting huge investments from tech investors, tech companies, and has been growing gangbusters. And it's not a week goes by where I don't hear of more and more towns that are like either adopting it or arguing about it. Reporters call me, what do you think? And it's a real problem. I mean, this is a real location tracking system that is growing by leaps and bounds.
Yeah, we had a similar thing with the cell phone tracking, and we were trying to get at least require a warrant to get cell phone data to try to pinpoint where people were. But it seems to me, and I was thinking about this when we were talking about drone surveillance. Like if you have drones that are covering 32 square miles, they're pulling in tons and tons of visual data. And the real issue for me, or the issue becomes more of an issue for me when I think of AI being applied to that data, because if you have that much data and you just have humans trying to keep track of it, there's less to worry about. But you can apply AI to that, can't you? And make your surveillance much more, I don't know, potentially egregious.
Yeah, totally. I think AI is kind of the game, and I wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago called "The Dawn of Robot Surveillance," which is really about AI video analytics. And there's a lot of different areas of video analytics, but one of them is definitely like interpretation of aerial footage. In fact, there was a whole controversy within Google. I've forgotten the name of it, but there was a Google program that was helping the military do exactly that, because the military uses these gigapixel cameras overseas.
Was that Project Maven?
Yeah, yes, thank you. And Google employees objected to applying their AI talents to helping the military engage in this kind of surveillance stuff. And I think that Google pulled out, at least for a while. They may have gotten back in. But very much so. I mean, as not only aerial cameras, but other video cameras as well, as they proliferate, it becomes cheaper and cheaper to collect the data. But that video data has always been very impenetrable and hard to access, unlike, for example, doing text searches on text data. But that's increasingly no longer the case. The video camera marketplace has become commodified. So it used to be that the camera companies would compete on who had the highest resolution, who had the best lenses, the best picture, the best dark picture, and all that stuff is sort of equaled out. And the resolutions of the cameras have kind of top peaked, and now they're all competing on who's got the best video analytics. So this can allow you not only to basically have live monitoring of video, which even the government's own studies have shown if you hire a human being to watch video screens, they quickly get so bored as to be useless at the task. But you can have an AI that will watch and will alert you if something quote unquote suspicious happens. If somebody drops a backpack, if somebody's walking the wrong way, somebody's anomalous. And of course, these are very context dependent. An anomaly could be you're different from everybody else, which is, it's just inherently sort of conformist. But also context, a man without a shirt at a 7-Eleven in the beach is not an anomaly, but if you walk into a bank in Midtown, it's probably anomalous, So you can train the AIs to just, alert on anything that's different. There are big concerns about, obviously here, as with other areas of AI, about discriminatory algorithms, discriminatory deployments and so forth. But basically what this means is that tomorrow's video cameras are not going to be yesterday's video cameras, because we walk into a store and there's a video camera there, we kind of implicitly know that nobody's watching it. Nobody's going to pay anybody to watch it unless something dramatic goes down. But now there could be an AI that's watching it and is judging you as you walk the aisles. Are you acting suspiciously? Maybe it misinterprets your actions as shoplifting and you get hassled or arrested or worse. And so, one of the concerns is that the chilling effects from these sort of AI watchers will become significant.
My concern about video and AI really relates to the upcoming elections, because we're getting already AI deep fakes of political figures of, Biden or even Trump saying things that were never said, or doing things that really didn't happen, but they've been manipulated by AI to give a false impression. And that seems to be hard to overcome. Have you, has the ACLU been looking into the whole area of AI and political deepfakes?
It's something that I've thought about. we are a First Amendment group, of course. A lot of deep fakes can be parody, they can be art, they can be and so forth. And sometimes those lines will be hard to draw. I think our general view is probably that everything is covered by existing law in terms of creating new laws. Like, if you use it for fraudulent purposes, if you use a deep fake to to commit fraud, that's not protected by the First Amendment. If you tell people that the vote is on Wednesday when it's really on Tuesday, that's not protected by the First Amendment, and so forth. But a lot of it will be protected by the First Amendment. And personally, I kind of think that it'll be fine, that there will be an adjustment period. There could be some situations where there's manipulative video that has bad effect, but I mean, it doesn't take a deep fake to do that. Somebody circulated a video of Nancy Pelosi like 2 years ago, and they just slowed it down and it made it look like she was drunk just by slowing it down. And that was a nasty piece of work, but that kind of stuff's been happening. I think that people will be fooled once or twice, but eventually I think people will discount, will come to learn that these things are possible, and we'll come to judge pieces of information as they always have, which is like, what's the source? Is it credible? Is this a random Twitter video? Is this a video posted by the New York Times and run on ABC National News? Like, can we, the human and social context of a piece of information will give people cues as to whether to believe it or not, which doesn't mean that there isn't a significant portion of the population that will, that will be and always has been fooled. People who will believe what they want to believe and don't really care whether it's truthful or not, which we already see, and so forth. But having said all that, yeah, I mean, you can imagine some pretty scary scenarios where, some video, what's the saying? The truth gets around the world, while a lie gets around the world while truth is still tying its shoes.
Putting its boots on. Yeah.
I don't know what the policy solution to that is, other than to, keep fighting for education and people's understanding and media education, teach people to be discerning consumers of online data and all the rest.
I think I've thought about this too. And, you go back to I forget which century it was, the knock apparitions in Ireland, and people were fooled by a magic lantern projection on the side of a church. We would never be fooled by that now because we're so used to looking at images of all kinds. And I do think we get better at spotting fakes. That's something that isn't quite right. But the other thing I was going to say is it's hard for me to imagine a faked video of Trump that would make him look worse than his actual words just captured on screen.
Yeah. I mean, we've had Photoshop for a couple
Yeah.
decades already, so you could already mess with still pictures. And
We're not fretting nearly as much about Photoshop as we were 10 years ago.
yeah, I think everybody implicitly knows that photos can be faked, especially now with AI photo generators, even more so. But and of course, if a criminal trial depends on a photo as evidence, then you can get in, forensic experts who will try and see, tell whether
If
it's
you
been
can afford them.
photoshopped or not. And then there are techniques that will tell you if it's been photoshopped, and there are counter techniques that can hide the fact that it's been photoshopped. And that's kind of an arms race. There's a bunch of proposals out there as well. I'm working on a piece now with a colleague about all these content authentication schemes, in which,
Yeah, the BBC has one.
yeah.
And
And the way these would work is basically like your camera would digitally sign the photos or video when you took it and post the digital signature, or basically a hash of the file to, say, a blockchain. And then later on, 2 weeks later, when you emerge from the jungle or what have you, and you show the video to your editor at the New York Times or the BBC or whatever, you can prove that the file is unaltered because the hash, the digital signature matches.
yeah, the BBC's scheme also involves something tracking the chain of custody or chain of alteration. But there's also there's an effort at the University of Cambridge that I'll send you a link to. Actually, it was in a recent Net Wars, so you might have actually read it. Um, and they're trying to come up with something that won't involve creating a centralized authority that, they want to have a system that anybody can use to prove the authenticity of the photograph they've taken.
Yeah, my technologist colleague says that there are big problems with these schemes and are pretty dubious that they are going to take hold, really.
I
They,
think
re- they require secure,
the average person who takes a picture with their camera is not going to want to bother messing around.
right, although it could be automated in theory, so
Hmm.
the person isn't really aware of it. And it only matters if, you turn out to be the next guy, videotaping Rodney King beating or something. Um, but it requires a secure technology chain. So, it has to be a secure camera, then it has to be secure software that you edit the video with, and so on. And that tends to have oligopolistic effects, which means that if you're an upstart, nobody's going to trust your digital signature. And so now you have to use a Sony camera or one of their three rivals, and you have to use Adobe products or one of their two, or Microsoft or their two rivals. Um, and that's one concern with it. And there are other concerns about how it can be defeated. And really, at the end of the day, there's not a technological solution to the fact that some people are fooled by fake information. And really, what determines whether something is trustworthy is this human social context.
Right. And there's no technology you can deploy that will get rid of humans who want to fool other people.
Right. Nor people who will be fooled.
Right. Right.
Yeah, we just have to teach skepticism, I think.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask about kind of how ACLU is dealing right now with this problem on campuses. I mean, this is kind of the breaking news of the day. When this streams in a couple of weeks, it may be less timely, but at the current moment, there are student demonstrators on campuses who are under siege, I guess, by police. To some of us, it appears that the police may be overreacting. Just wondering what's ACLU's position on what they're seeing on campuses like Columbia and University of Texas and so forth.
Yeah, so this is very up to the moment, and this is right at the heart of our First Amendment work, which is not my area. And so I'm a little hesitant to speak for the organization on this, but broadly speaking, we are calling for, what we have always called for, which is that nobody be targeted because of the content of their communications, the content of their view, and that police responses be proportionate and not involve any unnecessary violence. And we have put out several letters on this, which you can find online, letters to college presidents about our views on how they should deal with these often difficult situations. It can be difficult for colleges to determine when free speech bleeds over into harassment and intimidation. But it's something that my free speech colleagues are looking at and working at intensely. We have represented a number of organizations around the country, such as Palestinian groups at colleges who have been shut down from colleges just because of the content of their viewpoint, which we don't think is permitted under the Constitution. And yeah, so but basically, there's if you look at our site, there are letters and statements that we've made that I would probably be best to just refer you to those for any more detail.
I just wonder if some of the technologies we're talking about now, the surveillance technologies, are relevant to some of these demonstrations. I noticed that I think it's at Columbia, the people who are demonstrating for the most part are wearing masks. They're concealing their identities.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I wrote a piece like 10 years ago saying that we're working 24/7 to protect privacy, to stop the building of, surveillance infrastructures and the routine tracking of people and so forth. And that's important in daily life. That's important always, but it really becomes important when there are times of social conflict, like in the 60s during the labor movement, when, everybody was a lot of people were in the streets getting beat up and sometimes killed for that, radical notions like the 5-hour work week. And the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement and Black Lives Matter and Occupy and we see this today. And you can see it again with the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States. Suddenly, the privacy of your movements, you're driving from Texas to California and back, that can suddenly become a very, very sensitive piece of information about you, and whether it's collected by license plate readers or your cell phone company or what have you. And when it comes to masks, that's also a really interesting area. I wrote a piece about that about 2 years ago. A number of states and cities in the US have anti-mask laws that have banned people from wearing masks in public, with exceptions for, if it's cold out or for medical purposes. And nobody really forced any of these mask laws during COVID, but there, before, during the Black Lives Matter protests, there was a number of people who were arrested by the police for wearing masks at police protests. We think it's selective prosecution. Some of these laws are relatively recent. A number of them, interestingly, go back. A number of them are southern states where they were anti-Ku Klux Klan laws. And they were passed by Southern elites who were trying to defend segregation and didn't want segregation associated with these thuggish KKK people, but wanted a quote unquote modern South, where segregation would coexist with a modern society, not including terrorism. And so they were trying to ban the KKK because it was making segregation look bad. And so they created these anti-mask statutes. At the ACLU, we think that you have a right to wear a mask in public, and we oppose those. And with the advent of face recognition and cameras everywhere, it's raised the stakes of those discussions, because you can and people have taken a photograph of a crowd of 30,000 people in a stadium, and you can run, if it's a gigapixel camera, you can do face recognition on every single person there. So that's a whole other interesting area around, whether people can protest in public and while being anonymous, or at least anonymous in terms of their face. If they're carrying a cell phone and the police are using an MC catcher, they may lose their anonymity. That's what a law enforcement did in China during the brief spate of anti-COVID restriction protests there, like a year or two ago, you might remember. So there are different attacks on your privacy. There are different threats, whether it's the government, the police, or people on the other side of you in a political debate who might want to try and stop you from getting a job or something like that.
I was just reading a piece that you wrote on the ACLU website back in December about a new point-and-shoot chemical detector that they've been trying to institute for the TSA and I guess other law enforcement agencies. And that was fairly frightening, because they seem to be taking this stuff really seriously without a whole lot of actual study to whether it's real or if it's reliable. And I see in the article you filed a Freedom of Information Act request. Did you ever hear back on that? And what's the status of those devices? Because it's a strange sounding device.
Yeah, so these are devices that the TSA, in cooperation with the NYPD, tested on passengers at Grand Central Station. And it's a chemical detector, like when they swab you at the airport or whatever and check for explosives, except it's a standoff detector. So it's sort of a device vaguely resembling a hairdryer, and they can point it at a substance from a distance, even through glass, and it shoots lasers at the substance. The lasers are reflected back at the device, and it can tell you what chemical it is. And they had a photo on their site about this trial of them like rummaging through some guy's backpack. And it raises.
Was this like commissioned by Marjorie Taylor Greene or
It
something?
was commissioned by your friendly local U.S. government. And obviously it raises constitutional questions because it's nobody's business whether that's an antidepressant in my backpack or Tylenol or for that matter, an illegal drug like cocaine. I mean, if they don't have a warrant, they can't do a search for drugs. Under the U.S. Constitution, a police officer can't just stop you on the sidewalk and ask you to search through your bag. The courts have created an exception for airlines because of the unique, compelling government interest in protecting aviation. So they can check through your bags at the airport, but they can't. Those are not general law enforcement. Those searches are limited to protecting aviation. So the director of my project had a case where there was a guy who was traveling through, and they opened up his bag, and he had like $30,000 in cash in there. And they're like, "What's this cash for, sir?" And he said, "I don't wish to answer." And they kept asking him. They called a police officer over who answered him, and he refused to answer. I think he missed his flight. You don't get to ask general law enforcement questions like that when you're at TSA security. It is not related to aviation security. You can't test for drugs while you're doing, those swabs, they test for explosives. They can't test for drugs. This guy turned out was working for the Rand Paul presidential campaign and was selling swag, which is why he had all this cash, and he was a libertarian, which is why he refused to answer the questions and knew his rights. We won that case in the TSA. We settled with them, and they agreed to send out a memo to all their searchers, reminding them of the limits of their authority and so forth. But if these standoff chemical detectors are looking for drugs everywhere without a warrant in people's personal belongings, that would be a constitutional problem. And yet there was no evidence that the TSA had thought about it, had done a privacy analysis, had done a legal analysis of it, or what have you, which is why we filed the FOIA. And we haven't heard back yet.
What if you're going through TSA and you have like a bale of marijuana in your bag?
Well, there's something called the plain view doctrine, I think, where and of course marijuana is legal in many states, but still illegal under federal law. And
Yeah, I was thinking where it's illegal.
Yeah. And TSA agents are not law enforcement officers, but nothing stops them from calling a law. My understanding of the law is, again, I'm not a lawyer, is that nothing stops them from calling in the cop on duty there because, it's in plain view. But, if there's a white powder and it's not a threat to aviation, they don't have a right to know if it's crushed aspirin or whatever else it is. So that's why I fixated on that. And there's another example of a really cutting edge technology that can have implications for our privacy if it becomes normalized. These things are like $60,000, these scanners. So there's no great danger that they're going to be in every police officer's kit anytime soon, but they could be. And, fast forward 10 or 20 years. And it's just another thing that we need to consider. It's a pretty amazing technology. Yeah, you ask a good question about like how effective it is. And with these kind of technologies, we worry about them when they work well, and we worry about them when they don't work well for different reasons.
Yeah. Have you flown lately?
Have I flown? Sorry.
Have you flown lately?
Yeah, I have.
Have you encountered these face recognition systems that they've been deploying without asking anybody?
I have.
They're supposed to tell you have the right to opt out, but they don't. If you tell them you have the right to opt out, the gate staff don't seem to know anything about it.
Yeah, and there are different ones at the board. There are ones on entry from an international port. There are ones from the biometric exit, and then there are domestic flight ones.
I was thinking of the biometric exit. It's the one I've encountered.
Okay, yeah. So there are also machines where they're trying to standardize these TSAs. TSA is another area that I cover. I could go on at great length about this, but basically they are computerized versions that check your ID for you. they scan your license at the photo of it, and then they take a picture of you, and then they decide if you're the same person or not. It's basically a machine equivalent of what the guy in the line is supposed to do when he checks your ID. And those are, the TSA doesn't retain the photo, so they're relatively harmless, but it is sort of normalizing face recognition. It's unnecessary. It's and so forth. And then the CBP also has done this thing. So Congress basically mandated that DHS check people when they're leaving the United States to try and keep track of visa overstays. The United States, unlike other countries like in Europe, does not have an infrastructure for checking passports when you exit the US. And so CBP tried to do this on the cheap by asking the airlines on its behalf to do a face recognition scan of everybody as they board a departing international flight. And what they do is they assemble a gallery of photos of everybody who's on the plane, and then they take a photo of you as you're stepping on the plane, and they make sure that you're in the gallery. And then they say they flush it all. It's face recognition is like, it's just a hugely powerful surveillance network and surveillance technology, and they're using it for these relatively frivolous purposes in aviation, normalizing face recognition. And it's very stupid, and it's going to have harmful effects in society. But there are also questions about accuracy and so forth. But the TSA has I've written about this, written a piece about this with TSA and DHS, TSA and CBP have grand plans for how face recognition will be used in the future in aviation. And we're trying to stop it. There is a proposed legislation on Capitol Hill that would ban the TSA from using face recognition or expanding their face recognition. We'll see if it goes anywhere.
So how involved are you in legislative advocacy? I mean, it seems the Congress is kind of a mess right now. Isn't it kind of difficult to get anything passed?
The ACLU is very involved in legislative advocacy. We have a team here in Washington of lobbyists who work with Capitol Hill and federal agencies to try and stop bad things and encourage good things. And also a lot of times just educate staffers. As everybody knows, Capitol Hill is run by 20-somethings, and members of Congress who have to deal with every issue under the sun from A to Z, often aren't very educated on particular abstruse tech issues like what we've been talking about, and so just having people who can pick up the phone, people on Capitol Hill call and help educate them about the realities of things is very important. I personally am not involved in that. I'm in the 501c3 arm of the organization, which we're not allowed to lobby more than like 10-20% of our time, but I work closely with colleagues who do that work. So yeah.
It just seems like it's kind of an uphill battle right now to get anything done. I guess if you're trying to keep things from getting done, it's probably a little bit easier though.
Yeah, I mean, Congress does to a close approximation of 0 things every year. I will say this sort of surveillance privacy stuff is different from many or most of the issues that the ACLU work on, and that there is a real bipartisan cast to it. I testified on Capitol Hill a couple months ago, and some of the MAGA members of Congress were 100% behind what I was saying, as well as progressives with sort of centrist people in the middle who hadn't really thought about it that much being the biggest obstacle. And so I think that in the privacy area, if you can get past people's animus that they carry over from other issues towards the ACLU, or progressive people towards conservatives or what have you, there's real potential for unusual cross-ideological actions.
Yeah, we did some of that here with EFF Austin when we were opposing. Well, I mentioned we wanted to require a warrant for cell phone tracking, And we actually went through a process of working with legislators to get legislation proposed. And we found that it was a really odd combination of people, including a lot of libertarians and Republicans who were as concerned as anybody about the privacy issues. And in fact, we got this great, like, bipartisan and very well supported piece of legislation together. And then, when they sort of delivered it and tried to get a vote, the I guess it was the speaker, whoever was controlling the calendars, wouldn't put it on the calendar for a vote, which was very frustrating because it would have passed if there had been a vote. And that's kind of what I'm saying about the mess in the legislature right now, especially with the degree of polarization that we have.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And this is something I've been dealing with my whole career. I remember after 9/11, the Patriot Act, some of the only people in Congress who were supportive of our opposition were conservatives. When we fought Real ID, we got a lot of support in the state legislatures when we were pushing for warrant requirements for police use of drones in 2011, 2014. Most of the bills that were passed were, like, as with Real ID, were by red, legislatures. And so the challenge is getting people who hate each other for other reasons to realize that they agree on this. And often, and as you said, the challenge is overcoming the centrist powers that be, who often are the ones who stop this kind of stuff. But yeah, Congress is certainly as dysfunctional as it's ever been, probably.
Governmental agencies are always trying to get interesting technology that they can use, but I've noticed that private, well, not private, but corporations are also quite interested in things like facial recognition. I got an update to one of my computers, and it wanted me to set up my facial recognition login. Instead of having to put in my password, it was going to recognize my face. And that concern, I said no immediately, because my concern is when you have things like that that are being just, handled by a company, then there are no regulatory agencies that'll say, well, you can't use that login face for some other purpose.
Yeah. The regulatory agency would be the FTC, which would have the power. If you promise not to use it for another purpose and then do, then you're in trouble with the FTC for a deceptive and unfair trade practice, and they can go after you. But that's why all the privacy policies are vague, so that they don't open themselves to any risk of being accused of breaking their promises by the FTC. I mean, face recognition is something that can be a handy tool for the individual if it's used by you, not on you. But that's a tricky question, right? Like, I think most of the people who've looked at, for example, the Apple iPhone face recognition, where you open your phone, and Apple, I think people thought they did a pretty good job in terms of keeping all that data local to your phone. So that face scan and so forth isn't going off. There may be some questions whether it's shared with third-party apps, but I think Apple may have locked that down too. But let's, assuming that a company does lock that down and keeps everything local and it's under your control and it's not leaving the device and everything, then, face recognition can be a good tool. It could be a good tool for searching through your archives of personal photographs to find all the photos of, Aunt Millie or Uncle Joe or what have you. But it's when they're used on you that's the real problem. And like 5 or 6 years ago, I wrote a letter to all the top retailers in the United States, and I asked them if they were using face recognition on their customers, and none of them, with these two exceptions, none of them would answer. Lowe's admitted that they were, the hardware chain, and then Ahold Delhaize, the German supermarket conglomerate, which owns many supermarket chains in the US, they said that they were not. Nobody else would answer.
Did Rite Aid eventually say that it was?
Did who?
Was it Rite Aid? It was in the news a few months ago for that?
Yeah, I think it came out that they were, and it seems clear that a number of them were from chat in like the sort of the industry. There, if you look at people who install cameras and so forth that people post queries. I have a client who wants 300 cameras and wants to run face recognition on them, and so it's just skeezy and unethical. I mean,
The thing I was
if
going to say though is that on the individual level, it's actually it's a continuous thing, isn't it? From you start by looking for all the pictures of Aunt Mildred, and among your photographs, and then maybe you find Aunt Mildred in a position that in the background of a photo you didn't know she was in, doing something that she wouldn't really want you to have known about. Even just using it for a personal thing like that can raise issues too.
maybe, although if that's a photo that you already have in your hard drive,
Well, or you inherit photographs.
yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. But certainly it's much worse if it's being used on you.
Yeah.
And these stores, if they think that the customers are okay with the face recognition, why won't they admit that they're using it? And if they think that customers don't want to do it and they're using it anyway, that's skeezy.
My suspicion is that the phrase you're looking for is the one so beloved of the UK government: a small but vocal minority. A small but vocal minority will make a big stink, and they can do without it. When you were mentioned privacy policies, I used to have a friend who was in PR, and I wrote a piece for the Guardian on privacy policies, and he was out of PR enough by then to cheerfully admit that privacy policies are written for the convenience of the company, and they are cover your ass policies written by lawyers. They're not actually to help people at all. And I have not encountered anyone else quite so willing to say that openly.
Yeah, it's long been clear to people who follow privacy that they're useless. They're based on sort of a Lochner type legal fiction that you and this company are agreeing to making a mutual agreement between the two of you.
Lochner? What's Lochner?
Lochner is a famous legal case in which the Supreme Court decided before the New Deal era that the government couldn't set wage and hour laws, if I remember right, because it was interfering with a private contract between individual A and individual B being Ford Motor Corporation, on the fictional basis that they were sort of two equal people, creating a contract, and that the government couldn't interfere in that contractual ability. It was completely at odds with the actual reality of power structures, which is why it was overturned, and we ended up with, wage and hour standards and so forth. But it's often used in the legal world, as a stand-in for some sort of a view of the world that's legalistic and completely at odds with reality. And I think that the privacy policies are that way too. Nobody could possibly read them all or understand them all. Often you don't have a choice anyway, even to agree to them.
I don't. One of my favorite stunts by the Norwegian Consumer Council was they staged a dramatic reading of all of the privacy policies and terms and conditions applying to an average iPhone. It took them like a day, like 25 or 36 hours or something. But they made their point that just nobody has the time.
Yeah, it's brilliant. But it's like if you've ever purchased a house or an apartment or anything, and you're asked to do the paperwork for the purchase, you're signing, page after page, hundreds of pages and you really just have to trust that there are good, after 150 years of abusive land, purchasing and so forth, and all kinds of scams. A whole regulatory field is built up to avoid people from being ripped off when they purchase property, and you have to sort of trust in that when you're doing a closing and you're signing away hundreds and hundreds of pages of papers. And we don't have that infrastructure with privacy. You can't trust that there's any kind of government regulatory protection in the United States, at least, that is constraining what they can put in their privacy policies.
But isn't there also the problem that if you're buying a house, the downsides, what can go wrong, are fairly clear. The worst thing that can happen to you is you lose the house and the money you spent on the house. I mean, you have some idea of what bad consequences are. But the problem with privacy is that even the experts can't really tell you what the worst thing that could happen to you is. You know, I mean, 25 years ago when we were all talking about privacy, you know, somebody would say, well, does it really matter if somebody has your data if all they're going to do is try to sell you things? But 25 years on, we now know that governments will subpoena that data, they will abuse that data, that every company will merge that data into a much more detailed picture of you. They will use it in manipulative ways we didn't imagine 25 years ago. And we didn't imagine 25 years ago that it would no longer be possible to be anonymous in public, but we can certainly see it coming now. You know, so I mean, I think one of the problems is it's very hard to tell what the stakes are when you agree to give away some data.
Yeah, the wrong piece of data about you in the wrong context can truly ruin your life. It can ruin your reputation. It can.
You had a great term for it, the reverberations in your life.
Yeah.
I really liked that.
Yeah, it can reverberate and come back and bite you later, depending on the context and so forth. And that's true even if you don't have a particularly complex life, private life. You can be falsely accused of things. And the prosecutor can go through your life with a fine-tooth comb. They can probably find things to pin on you. Oh, you own this leather. It's a felony to own this leather from an endangered species in South America. But if you agree to, if you agree to plead guilty to that and pay and do this penalty, then we'll drop these other charges, which we now realize are totally bogus, against you.
So just here in the U.S., who is most at risk now from the kind of surveillance technologies that are emerging?
Well, I always say, a lot of surveillance technologies seem to start with prisoners, immigrants, and children, for different sets of reasons. And I think generally that lower income people of color are most at risk of being subject to surveillance and of suffering bad consequences from the surveillance. I think that, the racism that has long pervaded American culture and policing, part of that is that, Black people have to be watched. And that view and that feeling has consistently led to surveillance being focused on Black people and other people of color and low income people for a long time, for centuries, really. But now with the powers of surveillance and the powers that it brings being growing exponentially, along with so many other things in the age of technology, the stakes of that are higher. And so we see terrible dynamics like the one that was revealed by the Justice Department in their report on the Ferguson protests, which is that the city of Ferguson and other towns like it were using nickel and diming people on minor infractions in order to pay the bills of the city. And so you get pulled over for a broken tail light and you get given a small fine. You can't pay the fine. Now your driver's license is suspended. And so then next time you get pulled over, you get arrested for driving without a license. And you get, and the report by the Justice Department found that people are getting sucked into the criminal justice system in this way, being charged fines at every step of the way that we're supporting, and keeping taxes low for, the white half of town or what have you. And that terrible sort of Dickensian system lends itself and benefits from surveillance. And so one of the things that we're really trying to avert when we talk about drones and license plate scanners and everything is that these technologies not become a part of that dynamic, and make life worse for people who already have so many cards stacked against them in society.
I'm trying to think of a quick question I can ask. I guess because we're almost out of time, we just have a couple of minutes left. But I think probably as just a final question is, of all these things that we've talked about, what's at the top of your chart? What's the most critical thing that you're working on right now?
The thing is on my front burner right now is digital identity, and I don't know that it lends itself to a quick answer because it's a whole other area. But I guess the bottom line is that there are a bunch of people running around trying to create a digital identity system in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And the architecture and design of that digital identity system matters hugely. You can build it in such a way that you can do reasonable identifications and allow people to prove that they're over 21 and so forth without adding new technologies and infrastructures for surveillance and tracking, or you can build it so that it does become infrastructure for surveillance and tracking. And we're trying to be part of the conversations early and trying to educate state legislators and so forth on the need to do A, not B. And
Yeah,
this,
it's an urgent moment for it too, because age verification seems to be taking root everywhere, and they're starting to talk about standards for it and stuff. And you know that it's not enough to prove that you're not a child. It's not enough for children to prove that to be able to prove they're children. Everybody else has to prove they're not a child.
yes, yes.
I would find that hard to prove for myself.
I don't know. I think even the worst facial recognition algorithm would look at you, John, and would probably guess that you were older than 13.
There are companies
It's true.
whose solution to this is to use an age estimation AI algorithm to tell you
I
how
know.
old. Yeah. And
So we really are out of time. I hope that you would come back and talk to us more about identity. There may be one or two other people I could think to bring in to join that conversation too. I think it's a fascinating subject.
it is. I'd be happy to join such a conversation.
That'd be great, Jay, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on. It was really fun having this conversation.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.